Welcome to the Restitutor Orbis channel, and today we're going to examine the account of the Nephilim, or the Fallen Ones. Everywhere we look in our society and in our architecture, we see examples of what we consider angelic beings. They are venerated across the different major religions of our society and our current civilization. In the slightest details, we see these angelic beings, but what's the account of the Nephilim? We're told that the Nephilim were mysterious beings, or people in the Hebrew Bible, who are descended as being large and strong. And it should be noted it's not just the Hebrew Bible, but it's also the other major religions that have accounts of the Nephilim. What exactly are they? Are they fallen angels? Are they some sort of divine beings? Why do we have many different accounts of them? Naturally, the accounts that we have, the Nephilim are target for our current mainstream to deride as saying they're completely inaccurate and merely the product of myth. Fallen angels. Fallen angels were called Nephilim, and it derives from the Hebrew root to fall. They came to earth on Mount Hermon, Galilee, Israel, the sons of God, joined with daughters of humankind, who bore them children. And this is the religious text that we have with the account of the Nephilim. And it's intriguing to think of the fact that these could be angels, these could be divine beings, or perhaps they are even some sort of other subset of humanity. But let's consider some other accounts. It's unclear whether they are sons of God or their offspring, who are the mighty men of old men of renown. And remember that we're simply looking at many different accounts that have been translated through many different civilizations and cultures over time. At least if we go off the mainstream account. So, while the mainstream account tells us that we can put our total faith in conflicting accounts from governments and civilizations that they tell us were corrupt. And we know that the entire intention behind that is simply to have us trust over what we're told, even when it conflicts with what we were just told, so that we match our current thought process with the prevailing thoughts of the day. Consider the fact that we have other accounts that say we saw giants and the sons of Anuc in our own right. We were grasshoppers compared to them. The whole concept of giants is something that's been in human myth in many different cultures over the eons. Yet, were these beings more than giants? Did they have a different dimension to them? They placed their swords beneath their heads and their shields upon their bones, for the terror of the warriors was upon the land of the living. So we have accounts of these Nephilim as divine beings, as giants, as some sort of strange product or an amalgamation between humans and divine beings. We also have accounts that they were warriors, but who exactly were the warriors? What were they fighting for? And what was their true intention? The purpose in Enoch is that they were great giants whose height was 300 cubits, because a cubit is 18 inches. This would make them 450 feet or 140 meters tall. We're told by our mainstream experts in science in this current day and age that the presence and existence of such giants is physically impossible. They demonstrate to us that having such large creatures on land just simply wouldn't make sense with the forces of gravity. Even though we have dinosaurs that 65 million years ago this size was possible, all early sources refer to the sons of heaven as angels. And what exactly is an angel? And what is our concept of an angel? It seems to be something that renders a divine being a direct servant of the Almighty. Once again, though, there's also a conflicting account of what the nature of angels truly is. Are they good? Well, we believe they're the forces of good, but are they evil? It always goes back to the whole concept of duality. You'll find duality with the Nephilim, references to the offspring of Seth, rebelling from God, and mingling with the daughters of Cain. So here, yet, we have another account for the origin of the Nephilim. What does seem to be clear, though, is that with the conflicting accounts, even with the baseline text that we have from our major religions and cultures across the land, we can extrapolate the fact that there is something about the Nephilim that caused unique attention to be devoted to them. There's also a reason why they persist in our current culture commentaries, and translations describe the Nephilim as being from the offspring of sons of nobles rather than the sons of God, or sons of angels. So here we have a very human and temporal explanation for the origin of the Nephilim. So it's a conflicting account, conflicting origins It does seem to paint a very clear picture, though, that the Nephilim were a force to be contended with. And that seems to be the consistency that we have, regardless of what the source of the account actually is. For merely righteous descendants of Seth who rebelled, while the daughters of man were the unrighteous descendants of Cain, and the Nephilim the offspring of their union. So here we have a little bit of a mixed account. Why is it these Nephilim have so much attention devoted to them? And what is their true origin? Because we have origins saying they were divine, and we have another origin saying they were merely descendants of those that rebelled against God. And then we have other accounts that say something in between. In Aramaic culture, the term Nephilim refers to the offspring of Orion in mythology. So here we're not even talking about the classic monotheism. Now we're talking about Orion in a different mythology. Exactly, and also the concepts of what Orion and the various deities were when we consider polytheism. So what exactly is going on with the whole account of the Nephilim? Some people believe that they are fallen angels, they are dark angels. Alleged discoveries of Nephilim remains have been a common source of hoax and misidentification, once again, according to our mainstream narrative or account, making sure that we don't have any thought patterns or processes or concepts that enter our mind that we're not supposed to. And they make it very clear that giant beings or giant human beings were not physically possible, and they never existed. They also say that all these accounts in these religious texts are merely the product of myth, merely the imagination of some people who encountered forces that they could not easily explain, and so they use their imaginations and contrive tales to try to explain these forces that they couldn't easily understand or explain. But why are the Nephilim so enduring? It's quite telling that we find the accounts of the Nephilim scattered across the major religions on the land, and still remembered to this day. In 1577, a series of large bones discovered near Lucerne were interpreted as the bones of an antediluvian giant about 5.8 meters tall. Now, of course, this was later derided or debunked almost 200 years later by the founder of zoology himself. I'm quite impressed that they managed to maintain the bones in such good condition for such a long period of time, and that this person was suddenly able to identify them. And of course, they're always debunked. An unholy union of angels and demons, and this is a conflicting account of the Nephilim. Are they good beings? Are they evil beings? Or are they really just beings who either give in to their internal nature, the internal conflict? Much like we could say the same thing with many human beings to this day. We have many people who are content to simply believe and do exactly as we are told to believe and do. That does not necessarily make them evil. Or does it simply make them victims of their own internal conflict, unwilling to ask questions? Was it the same thing with the Nephilim? Were the Nephilim actually divine beings or some sort of hybrid, or what they used to call demigods, a little bit of divinity in them and then a little bit of humanity? It seems to be something that the accounts that we have from the religious text indicate. That they're enigmatic. We don't really know what their origin actually is. We have what appears to be theories and conflicting accounts. Yet the concept of giants is something that is still with us to this day, and it's considered a fundamental aspect of the alternative research community, considering the existence of giants. And it's something I haven't touched yet in this channel because I was awaiting the time to introduce it, as we've looked at many different accounts, and we've seen many different architectural examples that have rather strange, colossal aspects to them. Now, does that necessarily prove anything? No. But taken in totality, with everything else we've looked at, and looking at the accounts of myth, and all the attempts by the mainstream to try to deride even the very consideration of the existence of giant human beings in the past, at the very minimal, that is quite interesting. Now, we could always go in deeper analysis about it and say they are simply trying to mislead us by devoting so much attention to deride or debunk it as their favorite word, or is there some reality to it? Well, when it comes down to interpreting what's really going on, you have to rely on yourself. You have to rely on your own judgments. You can't rely on some sort of alternative research website that has moderators that approves every single thing that is said and is not said, because that's really not independent thought or research for knowledge. What that truly is, that's merely controlled thought, controlled processes, and you either think a certain way or you do not. Now, looking at examples such as this, where we supposedly have documented examples, I'm sure they'll say that are not well documented, of human beings of the past, such as Goliath and Maximinus Thrax. And we've looked at this before, with the concept of giant human beings. Well, how does this relate to the Nephilim? It relates to the Nephilim because we have accounts the Nephilim were giants themselves. Now, were they really as tall as 400 feet or 100 feet? We don't really know. Could there have been some other completely different nature to them? Some sort of what many consider monstrous, or dare we say even extraterrestrial currently? And I don't think that's anything extraterrestrial, but it does give the indication that there were many possibilities of different life in the past. And even the mainstream agrees upon that. They just say it's on a longer timeline. Evolution was different 65 million years ago, and that's how we account for the megaflora and megafauna that we had in the distant past on our great lands. But giants, that's just absurd. Now watch out. Here comes a Titanoboa, and it's the size of a bus. So it seems as though they want to try to say that yes, there were large bones, but they all belong to animals, which scientific processes in evolution can explain. But if you try to consider the fact that there may have been a human being, or human beings, or even creatures that somehow resembled humans in the distant past that were very large, well, just don't even consider it. There's also the darker nature to the concept of the Nephilim. The fact that they seem to have a reputation affiliated with them, that they rebelled against the righteous authority at the time, and maybe there's some truth in that. But what's really the righteous authority at the time? We'll of course be assured that every account that we have is irrefutable, that if they say the Nephilim were truly evil, then they were evil. And yet also we have other dig sites that may or may not be legitimate. And it's hard to tell just looking at images to verify things for ourselves. We also know for a fact that there are certain aspects that the mainstream do not allow us to know, or that they have to keep hidden. And of course there's a variety of good reasons given for this, and it's a matter of national security, it's a matter of national this or that. And that's why we can't have the actual information, and of course it makes perfect sense, and if we accept that, so be it. But the concept of a different sort of being, that's something that's been with humanity in all of our recorded so-called history. You can also find many accounts in fiction and even science fiction, and once again this will be dismissed as simply the wild imagination. So people in the distant past had wild imaginations, and people in contemporary times, they have wild imaginations too, and that's how you can simply explain this away. You don't have to bother trying to think on any sort of evidence or try to ponder the nature of these beings. They never really existed. For things that never really existed, though, there's certainly a lot of thought and consideration that's devoted to them. Whether it's the alternative researcher that's trying to come up with the explanation for the actual nature of these beings, or it's some sort of explanation from the mainstream to try to deride or debunk their very existence. There's even the more elaborate accounts that perhaps these were some sort of different kind of creature, maybe something in a previous civilization. Given advanced technology that they had, they were able to use alchemical processes. Indeed, there's many theories that state that instead of evolving, that human beings are de-evolving, that over time we are slowly being reduced in our physical and mental capacity, and we're simply being conditioned, if you will, to be more obedient. The fact that the Nephilim endures in our mainstream could even be found in a certain brand of fighting knife that you can find that's actually called the Nephilim. And I merely highlight this example to show you that the name, the word, the connotation is still very present with us to this day. You can find many alternative references to the concept of the Nephilim. You can find them appearing in many fictional and science fiction stories and intellectual properties, if there is indeed such a thing anymore. But what is so compelling about these mysterious beings? And many will say, well, it's simply the fact that they are mysterious. It's simply the fact that they are in our root religions and they're in our root myths, that these beings don't exactly have a very specific nature to them. They seem to be quite ambiguous. And I think that's probably one of the telling things is the consistency that we have from them. They seem to have some sort of enhanced capability. They seem to have a different capability, both physically and mentally. And perhaps the people at that time were trying to explain the fact that there were a different group of people who may be more human than this depiction might allude to. Or maybe they weren't. We really don't know what was actually possible in the past. And while that may sound like a little bit of a contradiction, it's something that we always need to remain cognizant of. And the reason for this is that we don't actually know. Yes, I can look up in a book that was supposedly written from the 16th century about how much plate armor weighed in the 16th century. Is that account going to be correct? Maybe, maybe not. But I do know, beyond any shadow of a doubt, that plate armor that was manufactured in the 20th century or the early 21st century is going to be nothing like the plate armor that was manufactured in the 15th century. The overall point behind this is that the accounts over time change. They are modified, they are altered, no matter how much the mainstream tries to assure us that what we have is an objective account of something that happened 100 or 1,000 years ago. So we have to take everything together and try to come up with what the real explanation is by thinking for ourselves. And of course, that's one of the hardest things to do because there are many forces and many interests that you will encounter every day, and every single one of us does, that tries to prevent us from thinking for ourselves. And no doubt there's going to be a lot of objection to even releasing a video such as this. But I believe that the account of the Nephilim is very important. And it's important because of the fact that it's mentioned in the baseline text of our major religions. It comes about with our societal myth and the fact that every aspect of the Nephilim still endures to this day. In every facet of our society, the name and the reference has not gone away. And it's not the original name, which there's no doubt that it isn't, because languages change over time, pronunciations change over time, people are attacked for making incorrect pronunciations, and then a new language could suddenly be innovated in the future that didn't exist before. I mean, that's what the mainstream tells us happened with, let's just say, English, for example. English has gone through 3 different major incarnations over the last 1,000 years, supposedly. Now, who knows how correct this is, or how incorrect it is. But back to the original account of the Nephilim, they seem to be some sort of beings that are out of place in a way, and let's look at the consistencies between the conflicting accounts. We have warriors, we have beings with some sort of divine capability, we have creatures, whether they're human or not, that seem to defy the given authority at the time within the land. And what's so compelling about that is some of us seem to have more of an inclination toward sympathizing with those that are rebellious in nature, and others don't. It's quite intriguing, though we have to be careful because sometimes having sympathy with those that are rebelling is exactly what we're supposed to have. And then you can also say it just depends on who's telling the story, and who are the powers that be, and what do they want you to think, because a lot of times it's just easier to think what you're supposed to think, instead of trying to step back and look at it truly objectively. And what I'm really trying to do in this exploration is look at the account of the Nephilim objectively, because there is something compelling about wanting to either sympathize with them or even find them to be antagonists. And I think that's probably one of the most enduring mysteries. There's also the aspect that we have the flood account with the Nephilim, that somehow the Nephilim survived the flood. And on this channel, we've theorized that the Great Flood, which many cultures across the land refer to, was probably one of the original resets, or likely the first major reset that ended the first era and went to the second era, in this channel's 5 eras theory. There are multiple accounts from the 3 major religions of the Nephilim surviving. And I'd also like to point out that the Nephilim did make an appearance in a science fiction gaming franchise towards the end of the 20th century. In the Wing Commander franchise specifically, Wing Commander 5 Prophecy, where an insectoid race called the Nephilim appeared. Now again, what does this have to do with what we're talking about? It shows how the concept of the Nephilim still endures within our popular culture, and the fact that they appeared as an alien species with tremendous capabilities, advanced capabilities that overwhelm the powers in that fictional world at the time. Now, of course, we can go into the depth about the argument of the likelihood of space and space exploration and so forth, and how real or unreal it is. That's irrelevant. What is relevant to this exploration is the actual existence and the reference to the name of the creature of the Nephilim. And of course, in this fictional universe, they are referred to as evil beings that are very threatening, and indeed the main protagonist of the series finally meets his demise at the hand of these Nephilim, the main protagonist who had survived so many other things, and despite having many great challenges and overcoming them against great odds, finally meets his end. So it's safe to say there is something very formidable about the concept of the Nephilim, whether they are protagonists, antagonists, whether they're good or evil, or something in between. We have the references to them, that they have tremendous capabilities, that they seem to have an entirely different society or civilization. So behind all of these different accounts and all these conflicts in our perceptions of what the Nephilim truly are, we have to posit a few theories in terms of who they were and how they fit into the 5 eras theory. And the reason for doing that is because I believe we can find the actual explanation to who the Nephilim are, and it may be a lot more clear than we believe. Fallen angels. I believe that the Nephilim were likely human beings, and that they were more advanced human beings from the past. More advanced human beings from the past in our 5 eras theory, because if there's one thing that is one of the essential points of the 5 eras theory, it's how human beings are declining over time. Now, we don't have to oftentimes. This is merely a matter of our consent that we decline. And you might be asking, well, how could anybody consent to decline? Because declining is incentivized. So where did the Nephilim fit in on our 5 eras theory? I believe that the Nephilim fall somewhere in the Foundation eras, that very likely they were a group of human beings that did survive through a reset, whether it was a reset from the 1st to the 2nd era or the 2nd to the 3rd era. It's hard to be exactly certain that they managed to survive, perhaps the flood, perhaps something else, and as a result of it they endured in another era, as a group of human beings that were far more advanced, very similar to the story we had of the Tuatha De Danann that we explored several months ago, the legendary deities in Ireland. They seem to be a group of people who had also survived a reset. And what we can understand is that a group of human beings that survived a reset were much more advanced. They had much more capability than the human beings that seemed to have been around after the reset. Now, whether that was due to natural forces or a combination of natural or unnatural forces, or the powers that be at the time were continuing with the agenda of reducing the capabilities of human beings. Well, imagine if you did encounter human beings from a previous era. How advanced would they seem to you? Even if they just had increased longevity, physical and mental capacity, how different would they seem to you? Does it even have to be a vast difference in physical structure, or even just a minor difference in physical structure? And perhaps their very appearance was vastly different than anything we can imagine. Maybe it was the real origin of the stuff of nightmares, or perhaps they might have appeared as angelic or divine beings to us. There's many different perceptions to look at. And the fact that we have many accounts of beings that seem to be very ambiguous at best, I think that tells us the greatest story about the Nephilim. We're going to continue our explorations and trying to posit different explanations for where these beings or these human beings that managed to survive a reset appeared. But it should be noted that there are multiple accounts of groups of human beings from all of our major religions and all of our major myths that survived resets. And I think that's quite telling, that there were groups who seemed to be capable of surviving resets. And there's a reason why we are not to consider that, and why we're not to be aware of that. And even if we do acknowledge our existence, then we're supposed to think of these beings as antagonists, as beings that defy authority, and maybe in a sense they do. But what are your thoughts on the Nephilim? Let me know in the comments, because I think we have a lot of indications. Thank you for joining me. Please like, comment, and subscribe. Fire and wind come from the sky, and we're told that the Titan Prometheus provided humanity with the gift of fire, the gift of civilization. Yet fire is used in the fifth age of humanity, the Iron Age, as the ultimate implement to control, where might makes right. Today in this exploration, we examine the power of fire, the ultimate destroyer. We're going to consider how fire has been used for the last 150 years to control humanity. We begin by examining the Great Fire at Boston in November 1872. The downtown area of Boston had undergone rapid development, but the water mains had not been upgraded during these years. Roy is given an explanation for these incredible fires. And we examine the city fires that occurred in the 19th century, the vast city fires which seemed to destroy many wonderful buildings. We're also given an explanation from the historical account that the fire department was dealing with an epizootic, a disease affecting the equine animals, and they couldn't pull the heavy firefighting implements to fight this fire. Yet we look at the images of the destruction of Boston from the 1870s, and we see something that appears to be much more than the destructive effects of fire. Or if this was the destruction of fire, what kind of fire was this? Some sort of magical fire? There's always a scientific explanation for these fires. Yet this destruction, and where it ends and where it begins, doesn't seem to make sense, as we see there are some buildings that seem completely untouched by the fire, and yet other buildings that have been completely gutted and utterly destroyed. The fire spread rapidly, creating its own energy or firestorm. Tremendous heat generated. Although many or most of the buildings were made of brick or stone, the window frames and other fixtures were made of wood, thus allowing the fire to communicate to nearby structures. And here we see it again in this image, where the fire seems to have destroyed some buildings and other buildings were left untouched. They even admit that many of the buildings were made of stone, as we see here. During the course of the fire, which burned uncontrolled for more than 12 hours, buildings were blown up using black gunpowder in a controversial effort to create a fire break. So here we have another account, that those that were fighting the fire were actually destroying the buildings themselves. How many of the buildings did they destroy trying to create the fire break? And how many buildings were destroyed by the fire itself? That's something you'll never find when you look at the historical account. When we see this vast rumbling and when we see these strange destructive effects of the fire on some of these buildings with these bizarre diagonal cuts. What's really going on here, and what's really the story behind this fire? We always have conflicting accounts when we look at these pictures. We'll see pictures like this which give us the indication of something that's smoke-charred ash remains. Is that really what happened? Or were these buildings destroyed to create a fire break? And we'll see this in many cities in the United States in the 19th century. And one of the reasons we focus on Boston is that it's one of the cities that's not covered as much. Despite the enormity of the fire, only 2 Boston firemen were killed, with the total deaths numbering between 13 to 20, depending on the source. So despite this being a very destructive conflagration, not many lives were lost at all, and that's not what we'd expect to see from such an account. The 1870s seemed to be a bizarre time when many fires struck cities in the north. We could look at destruction photographs in the south and explain it as being the effects of the Civil War. Yet, how far apart did these fires truly occur? We question the dates on the accounts in these photos. A lot of times they don't make a lot of sense. Yet we have no shortage of photos and depictions and artistic renderings of the destruction of the fire in Boston. We consider the fact that we're told that the fire was out of control and that they didn't have the means to fight it, and yet despite the fact that they didn't have the draft animals to pull the fire engines at the time, they still seem to have the capability to get around and set explosives to destroy many buildings, to create the so-called controversial fire breaks. Yet looking at this sort of destruction, looking at the rubbling, there seems to be a variety of explanations. We see that fire seems to have an explanation as some sort of destructive force, that due to the lack of responsibility of the civilization at that time, whether it was the local denizens of Boston, the city government, the state government, they caused this kind of strange fire with this bizarre destruction pattern to it. And yet at the same time, the official account also admits to us that many of the buildings were destroyed to create a fire break. We recall seeing the same account about San Francisco when the United States Army attempted to create a fire break because of the fire started by the earthquake in 1906. Yet examining this photo, we see the destruction patterns that seem to go far beyond a fire. The official account admits that these buildings were made out of stone and masonry, yet they still burn such as this, even if the window sills caught on fire. It's another in a series of anomalies, and there are many cities in the United States in the 19th century that were subjected to this kind of destructive force, and we always have a different story for the incipients of the fire. In St. Louis, we're told that a steamer ran out of control in the Mississippi River, crashed into other steamers and started a fire, and then somehow the city caught fire itself. It's very impressive, though, looking at the distant skyline of Boston, some of the structures that we see, the tall towers, the larger buildings, the intricate architecture. And now we go to the Peshtigo Fire, a fire in Wisconsin that destroyed 17 communities across 1,875 square miles, reduced to smoldering ash, and killing as many as 2,500 people. 1871 as well, the same year, and also occurring on the exact same date as the Chicago Fire, just to the south of this area of Wisconsin. We see an entire area of the northeastern portion of the state affected by the fire. And we look at the deaths. There are accounts that followed that bodies were untouched by the flame, but watches and chains in the pockets had been melted. Nails were melted as well that were out of the path of the fire. There's something that seems to be beyond the normal abilities of fire when we consider the Peshtigo Fire. And yet this event is forgotten by history, because this event occurred on the same time, the destruction of Chicago, another city fire which had relatively few deaths and destroyed a lot of buildings. And no doubt they employed the same tactics of fire break. There are few pictures from the Peshtigo Fire, and yet we see the same kind of total destruction. Buildings reduced to rubble. We have accounts of people and animals seeking shelter in the water, even though the water was supposedly freezing at that time, although it was early October in Wisconsin and the weather can vary. Here we see the ruins of Peshtigo and a small group of fire survivors in 1871. What was truly going on here? This seems to be a wildfire that has many more accounts to it, with all the communities that were destroyed and the death toll. What exactly caused this fire? There are conflicting accounts. A priest wrote a number of these persons assert that there was a UFO that was spraying fire or causing destruction on houses in nearby buildings. This is an interesting account when we consider it because of the fact that while there are accounts of the fire starting through natural means or just due to logging, there are numerous people that saw some sort of UFO or flying object that seemed to target houses specifically and rain fire and destruction upon them. Is there any truth to this account? Well, it's hard to say, but it is interesting that the Peshtigo Fire is very suppressed when you consider comparing it to Chicago. There's other areas, such as Hinckley, Minnesota, that were destroyed by fire in the same way. I had intended to do this exploration before the recent fire of Maui even transpired. The reality is that fire and its destructive forces have always been with us. It's not just something that we have in the account from 1870, but we also consider that in the 21st century, the report of California wildfires increased immensely and suddenly became national news. Now, it's safe to say that California wildfires occurred in the 20th century, but they certainly weren't reported on national news so much. And now it seems every summer it's basically a recurring event that you have. All these incredible wildfires that they have named, and then tracking the amount of acres that they're destroyed, and how much territory and property is destroyed and how many lives are affected. Although the interesting thing about the wildfires is we don't tend to get the reports of the death toll that we'd expect. Why was the Peshtigo fire in Wisconsin so devastating, but many of the wildfires in California and the city fires that we just looked at producing such a low count of death? It's very strange. Yet we consider the many photos that we have of destruction of communities in California, and we'll see something strange like this. This is supposed to be a wildfire, but we only see the structures themselves destroyed and the surrounding vegetation appearing untouched. What's truly going on here? Even the trees in the middle of the houses just appear to be singed. Many other explorers have looked at this and tried to ponder what the explanation is. Is this a fire? Is this some sort of implement of control? Or is this something else? Consider the fact that these structures have been completely reduced to essentially nothing. They're bare foundations. And in California, modern architecture techniques do not provide basement foundations. And some of these pictures or renderings that we have of wildfires strike the imagination, bringing fear of a force that is completely uncontrolled and something that we're often told is our responsibility due to the way that we live, or oftentimes even just the way that we live, whether it's because of the fact that we use the technological implements that we're told to by the civilization that we live in, that it sets the conditions that causes these fires. And we're told this repeatedly. I enjoy this photo here. It's supposedly a satellite photo of one of the wildfires in California. I like how they even have the state boundaries depicted. I guess if you fly high enough, you'll see state boundaries. Regardless, it definitely paints the picture, though, that these wildfires are something that the powers that be want to remain in the public consciousness. And it's not just California that you'll see wildfires reported in, although that seems to be the area that they're reported in repeatedly. This is the image that we'll have of a wildfire, and we can see why this would strike fear in the hearts of any person who looks at this. A vast wall of flame that seems unstoppable. It requires the dry vegetation, and it's certain to say that the wind and dryness in California sets the perfect conditions for wildfire. I've lived in California. I've actually driven past many of these wildfires as they were burning. And you can understand with the wind and the dry vegetation that a simple act of irresponsibility could cause a conflagration such as this. However, we see that these fires have been with us for 150 years, and it's not just in California, it's in Canada in the summer where we've had reports of wildfires. Canada, a place that we traditionally don't associate with wildfires, and yet they seem to occur there as well. Are they just limited to Canada currently? Or are there other areas across the land where we have wildfires? I like this crystal ball fisheye view of the lands, and we're told that all the continents are subjected to and vulnerable to the concept of wildfire, whether it's Europe, Africa, Asia, for a variety of reasons. Oftentimes we'll be told that our lifestyle over the past decades or the past century have created conditions that cause wildfires to strike up in any random location. Even Indonesia and Australia, where we've had reports of wildfires. And we certainly don't want to forget the Amazon, where we've had reports of wildfires. So it seems that in our current setting that wildfires can occur any place, at any time. And they can threaten us. They can threaten our dwellings. They can threaten our livelihood. And there's really not a lot that we can do about it. It seems to be another one of those phenomena that we are just completely helpless to counter or to continue our way of life. And so why is it that our media reports this? And now consider all the state capitals in the United States, considering the facet of fire being a destructive force that is not just over a wide area, but is very specific. The original Texas state capitol in Austin, Texas, destroyed by fire in the 19th century. Yet, oddly enough, these fires were kept specific to these buildings. Almost a surgical destructive force, as opposed to a destructive force over a wide area. And then there was another fire in the subsequent Texas capitol, but this capitol survived in the 1980s, so official sources tell us. You ever consider how many state capitals are vulnerable to fire? And why is it we always have these fires that seem to strike our state capitals, the very heart of our local governments? Even the beautiful five-domed Iowa state capitol was subjected to a fire in the early 20th century. Fortunately, it survived. Apparently, the firefighting implements in Des Moines were ready to respond at the time to this capitol fire. It's also interesting when you see other pictures of the Iowa state capitol that there's many other dwellings that supposedly surrounded it at the time, but they don't seem as visible in this picture. And there seem to be other questionable aspects about this picture. There was even a fire in the old Iowa Capitol in Iowa City in 2013 that destroyed the old gold dome. Well, why is it we have all these fires over all this time? Now we have modern fire engines. We're not reliant on animals to pull our old fire engines. And yet, for whatever reason, all these buildings still seem subjected to threat or vulnerability to fire. It's very strange when we consider this. And have you ever really sat back and thought about how many public buildings, how many beautiful buildings were destroyed by what I term a surgical fire. In other words, a fire that only affected one single building. And the original state capitol in Michigan, also destroyed by fire. Keep a running tally. Look at your own state and your own county. Look at how many public buildings were destroyed by one of these fires. Why is it these fires just seem to be so precise in what they destroy and with their timing? And look at what a beautiful edifice this was. We see some of the signs of the beautiful architecture with the earlier state capital of Michigan. Why is it these fires continue to strike? What's really the purpose behind them? Are we to believe that this is just simply an act of recurring irresponsibility? People not being prepared for fire? Even Minnesota, its earlier state capital, destroyed by fire, necessitating the newer state capital, not too far from St. Paul's Cathedral in St. Paul, Minnesota. We see that this is a relatively beautiful building. It has a pediment, it has columns, it has a smaller dome. It seems a little bit more modest, and yet it was destroyed by fire as well. Why couldn't Minnesota have managed to save their state capital from fire? Were they simply caught unprepared? Was it the nature of the fire? We have many different explanations for what caused these fires. Missouri, which actually had two state capitals burned by fire in Jefferson City. Very fascinating. The saying that lightning strikes twice in the same place. Well, believe it or not, they say that one of the state capitals was actually started on fire by a lightning strike. Very intriguing. And consider the odds behind it. How often do you hear of buildings being destroyed by fire started by a lightning strike? Not exactly something I recall hearing occurring a lot. It's possible, but it certainly seems random. Especially when we consider these other accounts that we have of how some of these fires started. And New York. New York, the wonderful state of New York with its earlier capital being destroyed by fire as well. When you start to consider the probabilities and you look at all these state capitals that were destroyed by fire, individual surgical fires that seem to target these capitol buildings. Now, perhaps I'm going a little far by suggesting that these fires were not merely accidents or simple acts of negligence, but yet seeming to be intentional. North Dakota, its original state capital, destroyed by fire as well. You can find older depictions of the North Dakota state capital that seem to have a dome structure on it. It's very strange. It's also strange that when you consider the positioning of the state capital in North Dakota, in Bismarck, the capital city, it seems to be far away from the city. What exactly is going on there? We're also going to examine the subsequent state capital that was built to replace this one in North Dakota because it represents a strange amalgamation of building styles. Also, the old Washington state capital, which caught fire as well. So strange, so many buildings across so many states, all catching fire. What do you think is the explanation for this? Is it simple negligence? Is it simply because of the fact that our elite governments, with all their responsibility and their charged responsibility to govern us, that they were unable to take the appropriate precautions to prevent fires in the state capitals? Oregon as well, if you ever wonder why Oregon has a very, how shall we say, unique state capital today. Consider what happened to its original state capital, which had the classic beautiful dome structure. Yet another victim of a destructive fire. And consider all the different explanations that were given for these fires. There was a rag that was left unattended to. There was somebody who was cleaning and they simply showed an act of irresponsibility. West Virginia too. After a while, when you start to look at all this, it gets to be a little absurd when you consider all these surgical fires that just happen to destroy all these state capitals. You're going beyond odds here, where it seems to be that the odds become one. One is in certainty that your state capital is going to be struck by a fire for some sort of strange reason. Always irresponsibility or negligence by the people within the state capital. And we have the historical accounts that tell us that. Let's not forget Wisconsin, where we're told that fire insurance was not purchased on the state capitol, and then that same day the state capitol just happened to burn down. A state capitol that's also located in the exact same place as the subsequent state capitol. No, there is nothing suspicious about any of these accounts. There is no reason to ask any questions. I'm sure that this is all just a fortuitous set of circumstances, that all these state capitals burned down all across the 19th through the early 20th century. Yes, the U.S. Capitol. It was a victim of fire as well in the 1930s, supposedly. Fortunately, the fire department in Arlington was on their A game and they were able to put out the fire. But imagine if the U.S. Capitol had been destroyed by a fire in the 1930s. It seems to all be within that questionable time frame from the 19th century to the early 20th century. All these surgical fires and all these Capitol buildings. It was really at this point that I just decided to stop doing the research because I had a feeling that if I looked at any state capitol, I was going to find an account of it burning. And then we consider the aspect of incendiary bombing or fire bombing in World War II. This was a tactic, an operational and even a strategic approach, an approach designed to win a war by using firebombing to destroy an enemy nation's means to wage war by targeting their essential infrastructure, their industrial capacity, or as the saying went at the time, bomb them into the Stone Age. Although the individual who made that saying said that he never said that. He said that we merely have the capability to bomb other nations into the Stone Age. World War II was considered one of the most definitive uses of firebombing. And cities such as Hamburg, Tokyo, the Axis nations, major industrial cities were subjected to firebombing, where vast incendiary bombs were dropped all day, all night on these cities, causing vast destruction, utilizing the concept of incendiary munitions, which caught many of the buildings on fire and started firestorms, or the wildfire that we see. And this is a targeted effort done by a nation's military to destroy another nation's means to conduct warfare. Here we see the remnants of Hamburg, Germany. Oftentimes, showing footage such as this creates trouble or causes controversy. Yet these are official photos, and this is the official historical account that Hamburg, Germany was destroyed in this means by using firebombing. Of course, it was fully justified, as the Axis nations were carrying out a campaign of evil, as we were told, and therefore they brought this sort of destruction upon themselves, and that's how it's justified. Yet these weren't the only nations that these sort of bombing campaigns were used on. And even here we see some of the old world architecture that does survive in Hamburg. It's amazing that anything survives such a firebombing campaign at all, and it's a testament to this architecture and its construction capability. But why is it some buildings that have the same construction capability were destroyed and others survived? Yet the firebombing was used in the Vietnam conflict, with many napalm strikes, and even the same United States Army or United States Air Force commander, he started in the Army Air Force, suggesting that the concept of bombing a nation into a Stone Age would be a way to win the war. But how exactly did the Vietnam conflict end up for the United States? Certainly, the United States did not achieve its stated political goals in the Vietnam War by retaining South Vietnam. And here we look at the Hiroshima strike photo. Although we're told that later this is actually not the atomic mushroom cloud, but a pyrocumulus cloud over Hiroshima, a firestorm, the fires that were started by the atomic detonation. But this is not the mushroom cloud from the atomic detonation itself. This is the pyrocumulus cloud from the subsequent firestorm. It's interesting how much they look alike. However, it shows the destructive forces of fire. This is General Curtis LeMay, the primary proponent from the United States Air Force for the firebombing campaigns. And it's interesting that he was the one who suggested that Air Forces, the United States Air Force, be equipped to conduct a strategic bombing campaign. Well, he did actually fly a KC-135 Strato tanker, so you have to respect a general that actually got in the pilot's seat. However, it's interesting that what he set up for the United States Air Force, the official account says that it wasn't prepared to conduct the war in Vietnam, as it wasn't prepared to conduct a close air support role. Strangely enough, a propaganda photo that shows the Statue of Liberty burning, that liberty shall not perish from the earth, by Liberty Bonds. It's stated that no Air Force in World War I, when this poster was produced, had the capability to conduct strategic bombing. Yet, oddly enough, we have an account of flying devices in Peshtigo in 1870 that seemed to do just that very thing. So what's really going on? Is there more reason to question the official account and the chronology that we're given of history when we see a poster like this? Well, this is simply to encourage people to support the war effort. And then finally, we consider how fire is questioned by modern individuals, such as Ben Tippett here, a PhD student who is studying, and his thesis researches the determinants of wealth concentration. Yes, of course, it's a class crisis. That's really what these wildfires are about. Some people have the resources to protect their houses in California because they have money and they can hire their own private firefighting forces, and others are simply subjected to the whims of the vast fires. But is that what's really going on? What's really going on with these fires? Or is Ben simply another unfortunate individual who's simply being used by the system? Incessantly in the news, these fires are. The world is on fire, and there's nothing we can do about it. It can happen any place at any time. Authorities will adapt to protect you. The conclusions about these fires is that fire destruction is at any scale, surgical or wide. It's always associated with the policy, how we live, or how we manage ourselves, and it's always present in any terrain at any time. It's always with us. Fire is fear, and it's noted in history repeatedly. It's present in war, peace, and everything between. It seems to be that the ambiguity of fire, whether it's our irresponsibility or whether it's an intentional destruction force. This video is dedicated to every life lost to fire. Thank you for joining me. Please like, comment, and subscribe.
I'm no sorcerer, but I'll gladly test your steel, old friend.
Today we explore the Agonic Line terror, a merging of realities. But in order to understand the Agonic Line, we have to examine accounts of lost ships and planes. And we begin by examining the account of Flight 19, a squadron of 5 torpedo dive bombers that disappeared in 1945 after World War II. This flight of 5 Avengers was under the command of Lieutenant Charles C. Taylor, United States Navy Reserve. It's a well-known and well-studied mystery which has had many different perspectives on examining the account of what really happened. It should be noted that in this particular plane, it was 1 crew member short, although there are conflicting accounts that say that there was a substitute crew member to fill in as the radio operator of this plane. I'd also like to highlight that the other planes had pilots that were of the same rank of the flight commander, Captain George Stivers, who was in the United States Marine Corps, and then in this other plane of Flight 19, under the command of Captain Edward Powers. Both of them shared the same rank and pay grade as Charles Taylor. This situation was quite famous because 14 airmen were missing, conducting a training flight after World War II. It should be noted that Charles Taylor was actually a veteran of World War II, and had served on the USS Hancock, a Essex-class carrier towards the end of World War II. This was considered quite an unprecedented disappearance, though, because Charles Taylor was a combat veteran and had managed to find his way around the Pacific Ocean. We all understand, if you're familiar with the story of Flight 19, that this involved navigational errors, and specifically, Charles Taylor was the individual who was initially blamed for the fact that the flight became disoriented and was unable to find its way back to its home base, or its original air station in Fort Lauderdale. Quite an intriguing account, though, when we look at the military record of Charles Taylor and the fact that he was someone who was actually elevated to the rank of flight instructor, and he had served as a naval aviator in the Pacific Ocean conflict. Our good friend, Skeptoid podcast host Brian Dunning, of course, condemns Charles Taylor and states that he's the one who made navigational errors. Brian Dunning bases his research on another researcher, an individual who we'll just call Lawrence because apparently I can't say his name, but I'll attach the link in the video description. And you can see that Lawrence did his own study 35 years after the fact. He even flew the route in completely different conditions and in a completely different plane. So therefore, I guess that's enough to say that he could officially debunk what happened to Flight 19. It's interesting to note, though, that they decide to condemn Charles Taylor as the individual who is responsible, and indeed, as the flight leader and commander, he is technically responsible for what happened. Although I find it fascinating that Charles Taylor did operate as a naval aviator in the Pacific conflict off the USS Hancock, an Essex-class carrier that saw a lot of action. Interestingly enough, it was the mother of Charles Taylor who decided to launch her own investigation after Flight 19 had vanished without a trace. Indeed, initially Taylor was found responsible when he reported that his compasses went out and that he was disoriented, believing he was over the Florida Keys, or south of Florida, and therefore tried to find his home station by flying on an azimuth that took him out in the middle of the ocean. That's what the official story said. To this day, though, there's never been any sign of wreckage of Flight 19 that's been found. And yet official sources tell us that the United States military had a very good idea and had actually triangulated the position of this flight shortly before it went down. Now, it should be noted that these torpedo dive bombers do sink rather fast when they ditch in the water. But it's rather strange when we consider the fact that this is right off the coast of Florida. There were several well-known radio triangulations that fixed the position of this flight, and that even though they were lost, the United States military had a very good idea of where they were, how much fuel they had left, and should have had a pretty good idea where they ditched. This diagram shows their originally plotted course on their training mission and a simple return to Florida. And it seems like it's simply a matter of 2 navigational turns to get back to Florida. Yet when this all transpired, the compasses went out, and for some reason Taylor was disoriented, and we don't really know what happened because we have transcripts of the radio transmissions. This apparently was the triangulation where they had located Flight 19, and they knew how much fuel they had left and had a pretty good idea of where they would have ditched. But as stated, no one's ever located any of the wreckage of these 5 planes when they ditched as they ran out of fuel. And it remains quite a mystery to this day in terms of what was really happening. Now you might be asking, what exactly does this have to do with the Agonic Line? Well, the Agonic Line, during this time frame, ran through this particular area. And indeed, it's been attributed to navigational issues, because on the Agonic Line, you do not have to compensate for the grid to magnetic angle, which you do when you are not on this particular line. You have to compensate for grid to magnetic. It is worth noting, though, that if these planes did ditch, they wouldn't have stayed on the surface very long and would have sank rather quickly, as there have been many demonstrations that show it. Although there would have been time for the pilots to get out of the planes if they were stuck in the middle of the ocean and rescue efforts couldn't have located them, then it's certain to say that they would have perished. But there's also the note that this Martin PBM Mariner disappeared while searching for Flight 19. The official account states that it likely exploded in midair. Although when I was looking at accounts of this particular type of plane, there's only one other example of this plane exploding in midair. No other examples. It's also worth noting that that same type of plane was the one that crashed in Operation High Jump under the command of Admiral Byrd. So what really happened to Flight 19? Well, officially, the flight was lost, and it should be noted that Charles Taylor was cleared by the United States Navy of any wrongdoing because his compasses malfunctioned. But why didn't either of the Marine officers take command if Charles Taylor was incompetent, or compromised, or lost? One would expect that would be the case. To this day, we don't know the fate. All we know is that we have individuals such as Brian Dunning, skeptoids who have confirmation biases, who simply want to state that they know exactly what happened, and other researchers. But that's one event. Let's move on to the same area with the loss of the USS Cyclops towards the end of World War I in 1918. This was a collier, or a ship that was designed to haul around coal, which was something they did in World War I in 1918. And this was another large news story of a ship, as opposed to planes that just randomly disappeared. And no, our friend Brian Dunning did not cover this particular disappearance, perhaps because it did not conform to some of his confirmation biases, or maybe he just didn't get around to it. In any event, in March 1918, while returning from a voyage to Brazil, the Cyclops and her crew disappeared. An entire crew of 300 sailors. Now, there was a war going on at that time, World War I, and there were German U-boats that were operating throughout the entire Atlantic. Yet it should also be noted that this ship was never confirmed lost or seized or destroyed by the Germans when German records were examined towards the end of World War I. So again, it's another disappearance. The commander of the ship, Commander Worley, actually was born in Germany, with a German name, but he had been in the United States most of his life. Oddly enough, he had some strange psychological aberrations, so once again we have another account of a commanding officer who seems to have been compromised in some way. Yet, oddly enough, none of the other crew would have done something if their commanding officer was acting strange. Military discipline just always wears out. Nobody ever pulls a Commander Riker and relieves Captain Picard when he's about to take the ship into the sun. I mean, I know it's quite an analogy, but we have several examples of this happening. Worley was stated to have psychological aberrations, walking around in his underwear and a bowler hat at night, and often being a strict disciplinarian with his crew, going beyond the means of even normal naval discipline. But beyond all that, what exactly happened to the USS Cyclops? One might think that perhaps there was some sort of German conspiracy to actually seize the ship, but again, there's nothing in the German records. And indeed, at the end of World War I, the entire German high seas fleet was turned over to the Allies. So it seems rather strange. And even to this day, the Cyclops remains a mystery of sea. Now, there's theories that it was lost in a storm, that there was some issue with something that they loaded on the ship and it caused possibly an explosion. But again, not a single trace of the ship has been located, or the crew. No mutiny, no signs of anything else happening, nothing ever located on the bottom of the ocean. So, a strange series of conflicting accounts. And looking at the individual of Worley, who, oddly enough, there are accounts that his psychological aberrations seemed to get worse right before the ship disappeared. So again, it's another mystery, much like Flight 19. But also like Flight 19, this also occurs in a geographical area that does run along the Agonic Line. Again, this could simply be a coincidence. But what do you really think? Can we really add any text to this particular story? Or is it really just as it is, another ship that just happened to randomly disappear? Now, the main reason that we're exploring these accounts of disappearances is that you might think that these are isolated incidences. And indeed, if they were, then perhaps we could simply dismiss them as misfortune, or it really was due to the commanding officers in both cases being compromised. Although again, we have to state that the whole reason that the rest of the crew, or the rest of the entire member of the military unit, did not decide to revolt or mutiny or impose order. It's just all very strange. It's very strange to think of the fact that an entire ship disappeared with a crew of 300, and this was towards the end of World War I. And there's nothing in the German records that indicate that this was due to enemy action of any way, shape, or form. And we look at this particular area, and we'll see later that this is the exact geographical area where in the past the Agonic Line ran through. So what exactly happened to the Cyclops? All we really have is speculation. And of course, someone such as a Skeptoid podcast host will tell us that we shouldn't make any sort of skeptical, or we shouldn't make any sort of inquiries. And I always find it fascinating that a skeptic simply means that someone has difficulty believing something. So they come in to do research with a confirmation bias because they're trying to disprove something, rather than simply looking at the facts objectively. Indeed, Mr. Brian Dunning claims that Charles Taylor's bad luck and his poor pilot and navigation skills caught up to him. Perhaps much in the same way that Brian Dunning's poor luck caught up to him when he was trying to run a cookie stuffing scheme against eBay. But I'll put those links in the description and you can come to your own conclusions about him. It's quite a tragedy, though, to think of an entire ship and entire planes just disappearing without any trace. Was there something off with Worley? Did he actually give a command to the ship that put it in a dangerous situation and caused it to sink? And we still wonder exactly what happened to it? Was this somebody who was affected by other forces? And indeed, to go back to the statement of Flight 19, there were other planes that had difficulty with navigation. And now we go to the Great Lakes, in Lake Superior, where an ore vessel was lost, the SS Edmund Fitzgerald. And this was not World War I or after World War II. This was late 1975 when this transpired. So we're talking about more modern equipment, more modern technology, and even more strange, in Lake Superior, a freshwater lake that's surrounded by land, certainly not the open ocean. And yet you might be surprised to know that Lake Superior, and especially the area where the ship was lost off of Whitefish Point, is a well-known area where many ships have been lost. It's considered a graveyard of Great Lakes shipping. But how exactly could something like this transpire? This area in Whitefish Point is very close to land, and one would not expect that Lake Superior would be that difficult of an area to navigate. And yet there are many different examples of ships, such as the SS Edmund Fitzgerald, that came across difficult conditions and suddenly sank. Now you're probably asking, well, wait a minute, again, what does this have to do with the Agonic Line? Because I thought the Agonic Line was east of Florida. Well, actually, would you be surprised to know that the Agonic Line has moved over time? And the Agonic Line was in this particular area of the United States in the Great Lakes. There's always interesting shipping that was always used, and these were purpose-built ships to get across the Great Lakes. And yet there were so many losses because of the unique conditions on Lake Superior. So many ships that went to the bottom near Whitefish Point and in other areas, and not just Lake Superior, but also Lake Michigan. It's rather strange. There's also accounts of planes that have vanished without a trace, and this seems really strange because wherever you're flying at particular altitudes, you can see the land off either wing. We also examined the account of what happened to the SS Edmund Fitzgerald, and it should be noted that unlike the other two examples, we do know where the wreckage is at the bottom of Lake Superior, and we have a relatively good idea of what happened. It seems to be extreme weather tore the ship apart and it abruptly sank. It was traveling in tandem or close to another ship during these difficult stormy conditions on the Great Lakes. There's also the legend of the Three Sisters, or the three waves that suddenly come up, rogue waves that rapidly smash into ships that are traversing the Great Lakes, especially this area in Lake Superior, and brings them under very difficult and overwhelms their structural capacity. There's also the reputation of the captain of the SS Edmund Fitzgerald, who was considered a hard-driving skipper, or someone who would take his ship through very difficult weather conditions instead of going off to wait them out in a safe bay. So a very interesting series of accounts. But once again, we have to recall that this was not an isolated incident, especially with this series of shipping accidents that occurred on Lake Superior. And we can find in other images that it does seem that during particular times of the year, navigation and traversing the Great Lakes might be a matter of a little bit more difficulty than one would initially think. Indeed, the graveyard of the Great Lakes accompanies the myth of the Three Sisters, and it should also be noted that there's a lot of Native American myths about particular creatures and strange weather phenomena that may be operating in and around the Great Lakes. Is there something from these forces that still persist to this day? Or is this just simply a matter of this being a unique area where there are unique weather phenomena that caused all of these ships that you see pictured here to sink, and the particular time and date that they sank within the Great Lakes? It gives the impression that even the purpose-built ships had struggles and faced many great losses. And we're not talking about the open ocean here, we're again talking about the Great Lakes of the United States and Canada, an enclosed space where one would think that navigation would be easy. And indeed, when you look closer at all the shipping that's been lost in Lake Superior alone, it does give the impression that this is a much more challenging area to operate in than one would originally believe. But what does this all state about this Agonic Line that we're looking at? Is this because there are some sort of unique conditions? And we stated earlier that trying to understand what conditions these ships, these planes faced during this particular time is not necessarily something that we could replicate even if we traverse the same area at a later point in time. It seems as though the conditions change based on some factors that we're not necessarily familiar with. Because many other days you could sail quite easily across the Great Lakes. You won't encounter bad weather. It'll be quite an easy place and an easy journey to undertake. But I would certainly not recommend that you go swimming in Lake Superior in August, especially if you're someone from Florida. But the Great Lakes are an anomaly in and of themselves. How exactly were they formed? Why are they so specific in their geographical location? And even more strangely, why is it we have older maps that don't show the Great Lakes? Perhaps the cartographers simply weren't aware of them, but oddly enough, when we're informed that exploration was based on following waterways, we would expect that the Great Lakes would be one of the first things that the explorers would be aware of. Regardless, we do have other diagrams that give us an idea of how these Great Lakes freighters could break apart and some of the phenomenon that would be responsible. Now, of course, this would be natural phenomenon, and the layout of Lake Superior seems like it would support the destruction of these ships. But again, it's a large scale of losses, and oftentimes there are other ships and other planes that have disappeared without a trace. And so what exactly is really going on with this particular area? We also look at some of the very unique original purpose-built ships, the whalebacks that operated on the Great Lakes. Quite an intriguing design, and yet there's no shortage of this purpose-built design also having struggles. And so we look at this in totality, ships and planes in particular areas that just disappeared. What exactly is the Agonic Line? Well, when we look at the concept of navigation, we start by examining the pole. And with navigation, we have three poles. We have the North Magnetic Pole, we have the actual geographic North Pole, and then we have the North Geomagnetic Pole. Yes, three poles for navigation. What exactly is the commonality? Well, there's three types of direction. You have true north, a line from any point on the Earth's surface to the North Pole. You have magnetic north, a direction to North Magnetic Pole, indicated by a north-seeking needle of a magnetic compass. And then you have grid north, vertical grid lines on a map, utilized by the United States military and other militaries for rescue teams and the accuracy. When you are not on the Agonic Line, you have to convert your grid north to your magnetic north. And on every military flat map, yes, they have flat maps in the military, they tell you exactly how to convert a magnetic to a grid azimuth. So you can make sure that when you've plotted a course or an azimuth and you're using a compass to follow it, you're actually following the compass. Now, what's strange about the Agonic Line is you don't have to make this adjustment. You don't have to adjust for grid to magnetic north because you're on the Agonic Line. So when you plot your course on your grid map, you just simply shoot your compass. And yet other individuals have stated that because navigators, whether they were naval aviators or pilots of ships, they didn't actually have to make this adjustment. And yet they did, and this is why they had vast navigational errors. This is one of the official explanations for why these particular areas that we've looked at, and yes, they have other names to them with geographical names, but individuals like Brian Dunning claim to have debunked them, or rather they've referenced the researchers of others, such as Brian referencing the research of the individual named Lawrence, who investigated Flight 19 35 years after the fact, and after the family of Charles Taylor had passed away and claimed to have come to a conclusion. But back to understanding the Agonic Line, you might be surprised to know that there's a lot of drift in what magnetic north actually is. So the point that we actually have with magnetic north changes over time, and therefore where your needle on your magnetic compass is pointing changes. Apparently this has been well known, and this is documented on earlier maps used for navigation. Of course, these were earlier maps that, again, didn't show the Great Lakes in North America and depicted Antarctica as a vast landmass called Terra Australis. Quite intriguing, but they seem to be aware of this phenomenon, this variance. There's also the fact as to where the Agonic Line currently runs. And remember that it was originally further east, and we'll take a look at some historical examples of where the Agonic Line was. Remember that the Agonic Line is where you do not have to adjust from grid to magnetic north and vice versa. Yet if you look at other examples of these lines and these Agonic lines and where they run and where they've operated, you can see that there's vast differences for what sort of adjustment you need to make. So if you're a mariner and you're sailing the oceans of the lands, you need to make sure that you make this proper adjustment if you're relying on a magnetic compass. Very strange that the Agonic Line also happens to run right over the area of Dubuque, a city which is near the border which is in Iowa on the Mississippi, near the boundary of Wisconsin and Illinois. That's come up in our explorations quite a lot. What exactly is the significance of the Agonic Line? And why does it always seem to be running in areas where there's strange events that occur, or many disappearances, or natural disasters? Whatever the real reason for the disappearance or losses of these ships, we can see that at some point in the time in the past, the Agonic Line has run through these particular areas, whether it was in Lake Superior or in the Atlantic off of Florida. It's rather strange, too, that we have other maps that show the Agonic Line being further east. And again, that drift is attributed to the change in the magnetic field of the planet. At least, that's what the mainstream will inform us, although who knows exactly how they came to these conclusions. One of the interesting things to me here is now in this older map we have the Agonic Line running directly over Chicago and Peshtigo, Wisconsin, two areas that we've explored. And here in this older map, we can see where the Agonic Line was plotted in the past, in 1803, 1850, 1875, and 1890. And here's where you can see that the Agonic Line did exist in the geographical areas where these other strange disappearances occurred. And of course, like I said, there is that name for the, how shall we say, pseudoscience geographical area of Florida, off of Florida, but we're not going to mention that name because we're focused on the Agonic Line today. It's very interesting to me that other explorers very rarely look into the concept of the Agonic Line. And yet the fact is that we're reliant on Earth's magnetism to ascertain exactly where the line is going to be. And it also plays a role in how we have to adjust our map to compass readings based on where we're positioned. Yet, oddly enough, how exactly do we know about this south magnetic pole, this north magnetic pole, and the generation of this magnetic field? It seems to be something that we've studied, and yet we don't fully understand. It's something that we claim to understand. But what's really going on with these magnetic poles? Is there some other force that's being generated here? Is there some other explanation for what's truly happening? Because why do we really have this drift in magnetic pole? The explanation will be it's because our magnetic field changes. And you might recall that the only film that ever decided to try to explore the concept, a rather forgotten film from 2003 called The Core, which involves a group of explorers going to the very core of the Earth to restart it, because scientific meddling prior had caused the core to stop generating the magnetic field, and soon the Earth was going to be burned by the sun. And naturally, the solution was to involve building a burrowing ship made of a material called unobtainium, yes, that term gets used a lot, to go to the center of the Earth. And they had to restart the core. And you never guess how they'd have to do it, by detonating a couple nuclear weapons. Ah, yes. How many times is the plot of a film solved by detonating a couple nuclear weapons? Especially during this time frame. Well, the film had some interesting premises behind it, although it is considered fantasy because no one's really ever gotten that far into the Earth's crust, and even the deepest borehole doesn't even come close to actually reaching through the crust. These are the voyages of Captain Greenwood and First Officer Swank as they explore beneath the surfaces. But the odd thing about this film, though, is we really have to consider what understanding do we have of the magnetic field? Because this is really more of a fantasy film. They wouldn't consider this science fiction. And why is it that this variance in the Earth's magnetic field causes the Agonic Line to shift? And what's really happening along the Agonic Line? Is this a natural phenomenon? Or is this some sort of remnant of a previous civilization? Is this some sort of technology that they had attempted to apply, and this is what caused all these changes? This is why we have these variances in where the Agonic Line is, depending on time. And therefore, if the Agonic Line is moving, which we're informed that it is, because magnetic north changes as time passes, then how could anyone have replicated the conditions when they try to determine what happened to these lost planes and these lost ships? Indeed, imagine if this was some sort of remaining technology. What was it really all about? Did the previous civilization rely not only on cymatics, not only on frequency, but also on some sort of force and understanding of magnetism? What if what we think of as the planet's magnetic field is actually generated by remaining technology that's still from the previous civilization that we do not completely understand? And if that is the case, then what remnants of this technology are to be found out on the land? Has someone already located them, and do they have an understanding of what this technology is? I find it awfully strange that the United States military, during a time after World War II, decided to clear Charles Taylor, absolve him of all wrongdoing, even though they had the very clear individual who was responsible for Flight 19 being lost, and yet at the behest of his family, they just decided to say he wasn't responsible. It almost seemed as though the family was asking questions that somebody didn't want it asked, and they decided to basically say, well, he wasn't really responsible, his compasses failed, and that's why the flight was lost. Now don't ask any more questions about it. And then about 3 decades later, our special researcher Lawrence decided to debunk it, and then it was reinforced by our good friend Brian Dunning. But what are your thoughts? Is the Agonic Line some sort of blending of realities? Is it some sort of remaining technology? Or is it all just a massive coincidence? Is it all just the fact that these ships and these planes disappear in these areas because disaster strikes and it just happens to strike in the same place? Does luck actually play a factor? I'm surprised Brian Dunning doesn't ask for that. What do you think? Let me know in the comments. Thank you for joining me.